Hello, welcome to Ray-ality TV. I'm Raymond Bakari. Today I'm joined by an award-winning journalist here in Rhode Island, Mike Montecalvo. He co-anchors the 5 p.m., 5:30 p.m., 6 p.m., and 11 p.m. newscasts on WPRI 12, as well as the 10 p.m. news on Fox Providence. Mr. Montecalvo is also a Rick alumnus, which we'll talk more about in this interview as well, as a member of the Rhode Island TV and Radio Hall of Fame. Mr. Montecalvo, how are you today?
Fine, thank you, Raymond. How are you? Thanks for the opportunity.
I'm doing great, and it's an honor and a privilege to have you on the show. My first question here, you've been a broadcast journalist in the Rhode Island and Connecticut market since 1981, winning a number of awards and also being involved with a number of charities too, raising millions of dollars for great causes. What made you want to pursue a career as a broadcast journalist?
So when I was growing up, I wanted to be Casey Kasem. So for your younger audience, you probably have no idea who Casey Kasem is. So let's say Ryan Seacrest. So he used to do the top 40 countdown, and they used to play it on Pro FM every Sunday morning. And I loved listening to that. And I used to come up with my own countdowns. So way back 50 years ago, whatever, 40 years ago, all the stores would have a top 40 countdown, like the radio stations, whether it was JB 105, Pro FM, and I would get all of them and I would combine them, and that would be my top 40. And I would hang them on my door in my bedroom. So I really liked doing that. And that was really my first love. I loved listening to radio. I loved when they were interviewing people. That's how it started.
Broadcast journalism is a very tough job, whether it's being a reporter or an anchor. What do you think is the biggest misconception people may have about the world of broadcast journalism?
That it's easy, that, for a news anchor, all you're doing is, putting a suit on, cleaning yourself up, and then you're just reading whatever in the teleprompter. That's far from the truth, whether it's TV or radio. My friends, when I was in radio, used to tease me all the time. Yeah, you're only on 5 minutes every hour at the top of the hour reading the news. It's, I mean, somebody's got to write that news. So it's a lot of work. It's a challenge every day. May 15th will be 41 years for me doing this. So obviously I like that. I was supposed to go to law school to be a lawyer. I wasn't supposed to go to Rhode Island College, by the way, Raymond. I graduated from LaSalle and I was supposed to go to PC. That was the deal I made with my dad. And I convinced him to let me go to Rick for 1 year. And I did. PC at the time did not have a communications department, and Rick did. And the rest is history.
That's awesome. Speaking of some of the stories you've covered big stories during your career here in Rhode Island, like the historic 2010 floods, Hurricanes Gloria and Bob. You've covered the 2014 Boston Marathon, Pope Francis's 2015 visit to Philadelphia, and Pope Benedict's New York visit in 2008. Many local elections, Super Bowl wins for the Patriots, Red Sox World Series wins. I'm just curious, do the bigger stories like that add extra pressures and challenges, and how so if they do?
All right, so since we just got off the Super Bowl, we'll do that one first. I went to the one that was in Jacksonville, where the Patriots beat Philly. So there were a lot of challenges because Jacksonville was a tough city to get around to cover the Super Bowl. It was not like everything was all there. You had to drive to different places. So you got to think ahead of time. You have to think a day in advance. What are we going to shoot the next day? So for example, I believe this is a few years ago, Paul McCartney, they did a press conference with him on the Thursday, and he was the halftime show. It was the year after the wardrobe malfunction with Janet Jackson. So they tried to get somebody, that everybody knew that would be a calm show. So I knew on Tuesday, Wednesday, how we were going to attack that. What are we going to do? How are we going to talk to him? And then remember, there are hundreds of reporters there too. Paula Abdul actually showed up to that. So that was an added bonus. So you're always thinking ahead, what are we going to do the next day? Because the challenge is you're trying to get around a city that has thousands of people. You don't know the city. You have to turn stories. Back then, I turned a story for the 5, 5:30, 6, and 1 for 10 and 11. So we were out the door at 9:30 in the morning, and we got back to our hotel room at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so you're chasing stories. So something like that, that's the challenge. Sometimes the smaller stories, the most rewarding stories too. It doesn't have to be a big story. The Pope coming to Philly, I would put that up there. That was crazy. That was something like the Super Bowl too, trying to get around Philadelphia with Secret Service everywhere. I've gone to Washington, D.C. with veterans on an honor flight where they take veterans to go see the memorials dedicated to their service. The challenge to that is a lot of those veterans are in their 90s, 80s, 90s, some 100. I had interviewed somebody who was 101. They're in wheelchairs. So how are we going to follow them? Who do we want to? They all have a great story. You can't do everybody's story. So that's all prep ahead of time of what you want to do, because when you get there, it's showtime. You have to hustle.
Aside from those stories, I would also assume there's a lot of prep work into some of the big interviews that you've done. For example, you've interviewed President George W. Bush, singer Jon Bon Jovi, and former Patriots quarterback Tom Brady. Sometimes, personally, if I've done an interview with someone who has a big role, even in our local government, I'll sometimes get like a little bit starstruck, but not to the point where it affects the interview dramatically. Have there ever been any moments where you like felt starstruck doing an interview with like President Bush, for example?
That's a good one. We were talking before, I did about 10 hours of research on him, and I was doing a sports show at that time. So the whole thing was about sports. And for people who don't know, President Bush owned the Texas Rangers baseball team. He helped build that new stadium that they had. So I did, hours of prep work for him, and it all was centered around sports. And then, by the way, you can do 2 weeks worth of research, and then come to find out you're sitting with somebody and they're going to say something that you didn't know. So the key there is, while you're also asking questions, you're also listening, because sometimes the greatest questions are the follow-up questions that maybe you didn't know, or they said something, you triggered them. So that one, after, when we were driving back from New Hampshire, we interviewed him in New Hampshire. In the car, I'm like, oh my God, we actually got him. But before that, you're so, locked in to doing your job. The Tom Brady thing, he was a nobody the first time he had not started a game yet when I interviewed him. Drew Bledsoe got hurt on Sunday. They announced him on Monday, and he was going to the Warwick Mall to do a radio show. And I showed up at the mall to interview him. I didn't even know what he looked like. So there was really not a lot of prep work for that. So a lot of interviews, Raymond, there's not a lot of time to do anything. Bon Jovi showed up at HJY, a radio station I worked at, and I didn't know he was coming, but we interviewed him. I knew enough of it. I mean, everybody knows Jon Bon Jovi, but I knew enough about him. So it can go both ways, but I feel more comfortable doing research. But sometimes it's after the moment you're like, wow, that was Jon Bon Jovi. That was President Bush. That the Pope just drove right by us, looked at us. I was like, those are those wow moments.
I've always thought that was just me whenever I've done interviews. I didn't think it would be the case as well for someone with as much experience as yourself. Because I remember when I interviewed Senator Whitehouse for a documentary I did in high school, I was just thinking, this is one of 2 Rhode Island senators, and there's only 100 in the country. That's something like interesting to think about when you're just a 10th grader in high school and you're 17 doing the interview. But aside from those interviews and big stories, you also cover a lot of heartwarming stories, and a lot of those can be seen on your new series called Street Stories. Can you explain for those watching a little bit about the Street Stories and how it came to be?
So Street Stories, I think it's on its 18th year. Walt Buteau and his videographer, Johnny Villela, started that 17 years ago. Walt moved to Florida to work at one of our stations in Florida as their chief investigative reporter. So Johnny asked me if I'd be interested in doing it, and I did countless stories with Johnny. We went to interview the Pope. We've gone to DC together. We had a great working relationship. So I said yes. It was an opportunity to tell stories. They're not fluff stories. They're not feature stories. Some of them are real gritty. Others, they're about the human spirit. Perfect example is I found out the Portsmouth High School football and baseball coach needed a heart transplant. Apparently he needed it for years, and he ended up in the hospital. This was it, if he wasn't going to get it. So we came up with the idea of interviewing his wife and son at Portsmouth High School. And then hopefully when he gets the heart, maybe he'll want to sit down with us. So it's TV, Raymond, so it's got to be visual. So I asked the principal and he said yes. We had all the football players and baseball players and cheerleaders on the football team. They made kind of a circle, and we sat in the middle, and I interviewed his wife and his son. His son's a football player for Portsmouth High. And we did that, and she told me that she thinks he was going to get the heart on Good Friday. And we were interviewing her, I think, Tuesday, Wednesday. And sure enough, he got the heart. 3 weeks later, after getting a heart transplant, he sits down with us. And we went to his house. It was outside because of COVID. It was very emotional because he breaks down. He says on camera, the doctor told him if he didn't get a heart, he wouldn't see Christmas. And he had been needing a heart for like years. So the purpose of that story, it is heartwarming. It's a, hey, a popular guy, he's not going to die, he lives through. But one of the reasons I wanted to do that story was to promote the fact that you can be a organ donor too, whether it's heart, kidney, liver, whatever. And that was kind of my basis for it. And at the end of the story, that's what we did. And I've done quite a few of those type of stories. So, hey, you can make a difference too, like Mike did. So this coach made a difference. The other great part of the story was he touched so many kids' lives, he's a teacher, and a coach. So that was one part of the story. But the other part was, okay, how can we help other people? So that's kind of what street stories, it's not all heart transplant stories. We did a Black History Month story where they're giving away free haircuts to kids in the inner city, but they have to have great grades. They're from Providence, Central Falls, and Pawtucket. We went to the barbershop. It's a great story. So it's a lot of this different types of story. And we've done veteran stories too. I'm partial to veteran stories. I love doing those.
That's an incredible story. I also like the one that you did about the LaSalle wrestler and the joke that was made.
Alexandra.
Yeah, and it was Tony Petracco also wrestles too, and she was like, "Oh, I could take him on." I was like, "Oh, that's hilarious." I've
teased Tony on the air many times about his wrestling career in high school. Small world. We show up at the high school, and she's waiting at the door, and she says, "You don't recognize me, do you?" And she had a mask on. I had a mask, and I said, "No." She works at one of the restaurants near the station. That on Friday nights I go get takeout. And she's at the door, and on top of it, she goes, "Mrs. M," who's my wife. She was my teacher at St. Rocco's. I knew nothing about that ahead of time. That was a great story. Now, the feature of that story is she's a female wrestler on the boys team, yep. And she's the first female ever there to win a varsity match. So that's really what made the story. Plus, you saw it. She was a great interview.
Yeah, it was hilarious, and that connection with the Mrs. M being her teacher, that's just such a Rhode Island thing. It's I believe we say 3 degrees of separation instead of 6. Speaking of stories, while there are those heartwarming stories, there are also some emotional stories, like if a house is on fire or a crime scene happened. How challenging is it to deal with delivering those difficult and sometimes even emotional stories?
That's a great question. It's been especially challenging, I guess that's the word for it, during COVID, because it seems like, especially at the beginning, the first 6 months, 8 months, every day, there wasn't just, 5, 10 people dying, and that's too many, but it was hundreds. And you were constantly talking about that. There was that fear of COVID that, where do we turn to? That was difficult, emotionally, but you kind of got to get into the game. It's like an athlete. You kind of got to block everything out when you're sitting on the desk. You got to block everything out when you're out there interviewing somebody. Sometimes stories are emotional and you got to keep it in check. I interviewed a young woman. She goes to URI. She was hit by an alleged drunk driver. She was coming home from work, and it was in the summertime, and she almost died. She was in a coma for a long time. Finally, she snaps. She gets out of it, and her family agrees to sit down with us, and we go to her house and we interview her in front of her Christmas tree. That one was tough because it was great that she was there, but you could see she's still struggling, 21 years old. But I thought it was important to tell the story. That was a street story too. The basis of that story was, please don't drink and drive. It's great that she's on the road to recovery. We followed her to her PT appointments, but basically it was, please don't drink and drive. You have many options if you're going to go out. And that was her message too. So those emotional stories sometimes I've gone back and watched that story a lot. Not so much because I liked how it turned out. I just liked the message that they had. And we've seen just in the news this week, those 2 hockey players in West Warwick that were hit by an alleged drunk driver. So
yeah, when it comes to local news, they always deliver the most powerful and emotional stories, and that will even affect us in our own neighborhoods. And it's one of the main reasons why I love how Rhode Island has such a robust local journalism scene. And local journalism is very important. Journalism in recent years has faced a lot of challenges on a number of fronts, especially with the conglomerates, switching to digital. I just want to know, as a local journalist yourself, can you explain why local journalism is important for those watching?
Well, I think it matters because we're watching out for you. We're holding politicians, elected officials, accountable. We're people that are, responsible for keeping you safe. We're holding them accountable. But on the flip side of that too, we're also letting you know what's going on in your neighborhood. I mean, think about weather. 2 weeks ago with that blizzard, 24 inches of snow dropped on the ground. I think the DOT did a great job cleaning it up, but it was local meteorologists that were telling you ahead of time that, hey, look, this is coming, you need to stay home, that kind of stuff. So it's essential. Where would we be without people watching out for us?
Absolutely, and it's one of the many reasons why I'm currently studying media communication at Rick. I want to become a news anchor, get out the truth, explain what's going on in the political scene, and holding our elected officials accountable. And you've been in the journalism industry for quite a long time. You worked for WPRI, do street stories. You went to Rick yourself, and we have a lot of great student journalists here. And I'm just curious to know, what advice would you have for us student journalists that are looking to pursue a career in broadcast journalism?
So the first question, Raymond, you have to ask yourself, and this is what I did, is this something I want to do? And no, you're not going to get rich. My first job, all my friends were working so I got my first radio job in 1981. I was a freshman at Rick. I had my own radio show at WRIC, so I thought I was like, I'm going to be the next big time DJ. Do I want to do this? I got paid minimum wage. My first full-time job, I made $200 a week gross. So take home was about $154, not a lot of money even back then. But I knew I wanted to do it because I loved telling stories. That was the real thing. And I did radio for over 20 years. So that's where I started. And then I did radio and TV together. And then now it's all TV. So I loved telling stories. I knew that I wanted to make a living at it. My goal was to get through 1 year. And then my next goal was to get to year 5 and then to get to year 10. Well, on May 15th, it's year 41. So, and I just continue to have the passion of telling stories. You were right. Rhode Island, there's a lot going on. It's a lot of great stuff happening. I never moved. And I'm totally honest with you, I had job offers elsewhere. And it was important to be on the air in your hometown. It was important to play softball with the same bunch of guys for 25 years. It was important for me not to move. I have 2 kids, not to move my children from place to place. My wife was from the area too. She graduated from Rick in '85, and then she got her master's after that. She's a school teacher. So I thought it was important. And let's face it, Rhode Island is a great place to live. I'll argue with anybody that the beaches are the best. The restaurants are the best. There's so much to do in the fall. I don't like the snow. That part I don't like. So my advice to you is don't give up. But the first question you have to answer is, do I want to do this? If the answer is yes, am I willing to sacrifice? Am I willing to work 60, 70 hours a week? Am I willing to work day after day with no days off? There was one point I worked 141 straight days without a day off. And in that, I was doing radio, TV, and teaching in that 141 days too. Am I willing to do that? Am I willing to move, Raymond? I mean, I got lucky. I got to stay in Rhode Island. Not everybody's like that. Am I willing to move to another market? Am I willing to go maybe down south, up north, learn my craft, go to a bigger market? Am I willing to do that? Am I willing to ask the tough questions? Am I willing to sacrifice? If the answer is yes to those questions, go for it. By the way, observe everything, everywhere you go. Take a look around. Whether you're going to get a coffee or at the supermarket, whatever, take a look around. You'd be surprised at the kind of stories you can find. And then once people recognize you, guess what? They come up to you and they give you stories. Not all the time they're a TV story, but I've gotten quite a few stories. Just before we were talking, somebody had emailed me and I called them a potential story. I watch you on TV every night. I don't know if this is of interest to you. Yes, they're not all like that. So constantly be aware. By the way, write. Constantly work on your writing and speech. Don't be afraid to get in front of the camera. Read everything. I read every newspaper, magazine. I watch all the other television stations. Know what's going on.
Those are a lot of the things too that I also hear from our professional advisor at the Anchor, Jim Hummel, and also I'm actually taking news production this semester, and it's true. Writing, you got to learn how to format the rundown correctly, formatting that script correctly. It's all crucial, and thank you so much for that insight.
But one other thing, Raymond, the other thing I used to do too is when I worked in radio, I taped myself all the time on a cassette. That's how I'm dating myself. And then I'd listen back. So in the car, when I would be driving home, I'd plop the cassette in and I'd listen to the newscast. And I would concentrate on what I did well, as opposed to, that was terrible. Because if you improve on what you are doing well, you'll eliminate the negatives. That's kind of my philosophy. If we're constantly looking at the negatives, it's hard to get better. It's hard to get those better questions. And now on TV, I'll watch myself and like, hey, I really like the way I read that story. I really like the way I wrote that story. I should have done it differently. Your own worst critic, but it's worth watching. And then, by the way, the other advice, talk to people. I loved my time at Rick. I did. I had great professors. The late Mark Goldman, meant a lot to me in my life. He was tough, and I liked that. And he stayed on top of us, and he made sure, no matter what we did, that we did it to the best. And the other thing too, Raymond, in this business, get out and meet people. Do community events, go to charity events, help the public, because they're your viewers, but it's also part of this. We're supposed to be making a difference in the community. And that's one of my favorite parts of being a news anchor is hosting charity events. So.
Absolutely. And part of being a journalist is also helping make the world a better place. Speaking of your time at Rick, you had touched upon it a little bit. I know you also started working at WNRI in Woonsocket as a freshman at age 19. Was there anything else that you liked the most about your time at Rick? Like, did you become involved with other student organizations like the school paper, for example?
So I never did the school paper, but I became the general manager of, it was called WRIC back then. Now it's XIN. And we had a relationship with the paper. So we had a close relationship, but I was on student parliament my first year. See, I wanted to be the first Italian-American mayor in the city of Woonsocket. That's where I grew up. And then Charlie Baldelli, who is a friend of mine, years later became the first Italian-American mayor. So he kind of blew my dream. And I've told him that. So I loved politics from the beginning. The 1980 presidential election, I was like really into it. But then it get to a point where if I was going to do the radio station, I was going to take classes. I got a job at a radio station. I couldn't do everything. So I think I did parliament my first 2 years. I was class rep, treasurer, that kind of stuff. So I loved Rick. It's a commuter school. I commuted the first semester and then I lived there the rest of my time. Every school is, you make what you make of yourself. I got involved in everything. I got to know my professors. I told you about Mark Goldman. There were others that I really liked. Try stuff. Don't be afraid. We started, there was a deck hockey league that was in Whipple. What's in Whipple now?
Right now, that's where all the current communication courses are being held. And then there's like the Whipple Computer Lab. Currently, I go there occasionally for my news production course in my law class.
So that was a gym. And that's where we played floor hockey. And I came up with the idea that we're going to broadcast floor hockey games on WRIC radio.
That's awesome.
And people were like, you have to be out of your mind. And I was like, no, this is the students will get to learn how to do play-by-play. And that's what we did. We had 4 teams of 2, and we broadcasting of floor hockey. I don't know who was listening, but it didn't matter because it was a training ground. The newspaper is a great training ground to learn how to write. Whether it's, newspaper readership is down, but those newspapers have digital now too. Learn how to write for TV. If for those watching this, we need in our industry producers. And a producer is the person that writes the newscast. Not a lot of kids coming out of college are doing that. You can make a great career. It's a fast track. You can make good money. You can eventually go up to management, but it's your show. You know, you're seeing me tonight at 5 o'clock do the newscast. Well, there's a producer, Erica. She's the one responsible for writing that. We go in as anchors and tweak, we'll add, and that kind of stuff. So I would look for something like that too, producing.
That's awesome. And while we're still on the topic of your time at Rick, before I ask my final question after this one, as you said, you served on SCG as the treasurer, and you had the job at WNRI. With all that combined, were there, aside from like, managing time manager, were there any other big challenges you had faced, and how did you overcome them?
So the big time management was the biggest challenge because, we had five classes in a semester. I did fall behind in my senior year, so I had to take like 7 or 8 classes the fall semester because I was working a lot. I was at the radio station on campus every day for at least 2, 3 hours, 4 hours. We had 140 DJs back then. We had, it was, we were 24/7, not 365 because they weren't there at the holidays. And every time slot was taken. We had like a real morning show that did every day 3 hours, and then each disc jockey had 2 or 3 hours on the air. Back then there were albums. So that's how far back, there were no computers, they go. So time management was tough because I eventually became the general manager of the radio station. You're there a lot. I worked Saturday and Sundays at various radio stations. And then I had my schoolwork. And, but I graduated in 4 years. I had a job waiting for me when I got out of college at WPRI in West Warwick. It's not there anymore. So my time at Rick really helped me to get where I am today.
It's certainly an amazing institution. I didn't know that. Well, now it's called WXI, and I didn't know they had 140 employees. Was it still in Ducey, or was it in a different location?
So we had one. So the student union, you go up to the final floor. So if you're driving in to where the roundabout is and all the parking is, okay, those windows that are facing you, that was my office, the general manager's office. And we had that whole wing down. So there was the record library, the on-air studio, a production room. Then eventually we got so big, we took over the entire top floor. We got a meeting room and whatnot. So that was, between 1981 and 84, really when they really started expanding. That was a really big boom where, people really, by the way, not everybody wanted to be a disc jockey or go into radio. Some were just doing it because they always liked music, right? They wanted to play their favorite songs, even though people think that the disc jockeys play their favorite songs. Especially nowadays, you're told what to play. But back there in the college radio station, it was a rock station. So, we played rock music, and then we did the broadcasting of the games. We did Rick basketball games on the air because that was that was one of my top priorities. And then we did at night, we did dance music. So it was a classic, it was a rock and roll station till 6 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night. And then after that till midnight, it was all dance music. So we kind of separated the formats to give everybody a flavor. Then we introduced talk shows. And John DePietro, who does a talk show now at WNRI in Woonsocket, he and quite a few others had talk shows at Rick. And I think I'm almost positive he became general manager after me, a couple of years after me too.
That's interesting. I honestly had no clue about that. That's really interesting. I gotta look more into that. My final question is one that I ask everyone on the show to keep tradition. You talked about it a little bit earlier in one of your answers, and my question is, in your opinion, what do you think Rhode Island is best known for?
Best known for? I think there's a lot of things they're best known for. That it's a small world, that everybody knows everybody when you really think about it. This topic, just when I went to LaSalle to interview the wrestler, how did I, here's the young lady that gives me my takeout food, and I never knew it was her. I kind of like that. I like that a lot, that you bump into people, people. I think Rhode Island is a friendly state. My kids make fun of me. Going to the supermarket is not an hour experience with dad. It's more like a 2-hour experience because he's talking to everybody. I like that. I love the restaurants. I love being an Italian American. I love the Italian restaurants. I love the beach. When I worked at WERI in Westerly, that was like 1986. I did mornings. When I got off there, I drove to Musquamacut Beach every day, unless it rained. Every day, just with a blanket or a towel, and lie on the beach for 2 hours. And it's like, where can you do this? Get back in my car, drive back home, do the whole thing the next day, all by myself. And it was like, I just like looking at the ocean. It's relaxing. My family and friends are here. As I mentioned, I could have left for more money. I didn't. So I think Rhode Island is a very friendly place. And I think that's really the big benefit of it. And
Absolutely.
everybody knows somebody.
Sorry. Absolutely. Rhode Island, I always say it's like a tight knit, small community. You're 20 minutes away from everything. You see people that this person's the cousin of your brother-in-law, and then that person's also, it's so true. I mean, I'm in the same, for reference, I'm in the same zip code as the lieutenant governor and the mayor of Providence, just to give that a reference point of how small Rhode Island is and how close everybody is. Mr. Montecalvo, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure of mine to have you on.
Thank you, Raymond. Good luck the rest of the way.
Thank you. And thank you for watching this episode of Ray-ality TV. If you want to see future episodes as soon as they're posted on this channel, please click the subscribe button and the post notification bell icon down below. If you want to read the political profiles version of this interview, prior ones and future ones, that could be seen on anchorweb.org for The Anchor, which is Rick's school newspaper. I'm Raymond Bakari. I'll see you on the next episode.